It's been over 25 years since Titanic came out in theaters back in 1997. Yet, the film continues to have a long-lasting impact decades later. The film is a work of art. The cinematography, the sets, and the overall story are fantastic. Even in spite of the film's relatively weak romance plot, I can see why this film was a massive box office hit. Recently, I had the chance to see it in theaters. The first time in my life I'd seen it on the big screen, as a part of the 25th anniversary re-airing. Coming into this, I was already aware of many of the plot details as I'd seen it many years ago when I was a kid. I expected the film to be about the tragedy of the sinking, and understood the general overtones of the love story. Yet, when I came out of it, I was able to find even more that intrigued me than simply those factors. I noticed that there were a few lessons the film had to say that were hidden within the story. The lesson that I seek to bring to the light is that of how societies collapse, how they rise, how they fall, and how future generations perceive and interpret those events. In order to illustrate this point, I will be breaking down the video into three distinct sections: the Gilded Age of a civilization, the downfall of civilization, and the post-hoc interpretation of those events. We will also look at the characters featured in the film and how they fit into the civilizational narrative. This will necessitate taking elements of the narrative and rearranging them into a chronological order, only breaking from this if it's necessary to better comprehend the context behind it. So, let's all look back into the past and watch these events unfold. Part 1. The Gilded Age. We first start off with the elderly Rose relaying the events of what happened. When beginning to tell her account, she makes the statement of how the Titanic was the ship of dreams. From this, we can see that she views the ship and the time period in question in a romantic fashion. We can start seeing the civilizational narrative creep in as she equates the Titanic to a period of grandeur, as a more elegant, wondrous time. This point is constantly reinforced through the imagery used in the first half of the film. The film uses the young Rose as a framing device to show us the true elegance and splendor of the Titanic in all of her glory. We see the truly astonishing level of wealth on display from both the ship and the passengers on board. This is constantly reinforced throughout the film, from artistic choices to the passengers, a mix of nobility, high-state officials, and new money tycoons, to the fancy dining habits of the upper class, to the decorum of the ship itself. This all encapsulates a truly gilded age, a period of time in a civilization's history where the wealth, power, and influence are put up on display for all to see. Even how the Titanic is framed adds to this analogy, as the Titanic is referred to less as a passenger ship, but almost as if it was a living being in her own right. Virtually everyone on board the vessel took pride in her, from the wealthiest men down to the poor families in third class. In the film, one third-class passenger, an Irishman, took immense pride in her being a product of 15,000 hard-working Irishmen. To everyone, she was something to view with a sense of reverence. The strong emphasis on the ship and what she represents is not all too different from how we often characterize and personify a country. Take Uncle Sam as a good example of this same form of personification. As the personification of the United States of America, he represents America as a whole, from its highest highs down to its lowest lows. No matter the times, he is the embodiment of pride towards the nation. In the film, the Titanic is seen as something to be prideful of. She represented more than just a ship, but the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of all on board her, whether they be those who hope for a better life, those seeking greater glory for themselves, or those who felt pride for their homeland, or, in a less positive sense, themselves. The sheer level of confidence in this vessel led many to believe her to be unsinkable, to be outright invincible to all woes thrown her way. This sense of hubris compels J. Bruce Ismay, portrayed by Jonathan Hyde, to convince Captain Edward John Smith, portrayed by Bernard Hill, to run all the boilers and increase her speed, all in the effort to have her on headlines again for breaking the transatlantic crossing record. And yet, not everyone shared this same sense of hubris. Thomas Andrews, portrayed by Victor Garber, brings forth this sense of wisdom in the first part. In one scene on A deck, Rose and Andrews have a discussion about the number of lifeboats aboard, to which Andrews fully admits that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. This wasn't of his making either, as he wanted to ensure there were enough lifeboats for all on board. Rather, he was rebuked by those higher up than him. Around the same time, Captain Smith was reluctant to increase the speed of the Titanic, knowing well enough that this wasn't necessary. It was only through the pressuring of Bruce Ismay that he rebukes his better senses and goes through with it. This entire sense of hubris is something we often see in the highest point of a civilization. The best example on display of this is with the Roman Empire, where, during the reign of the five good emperors, the empire reached its absolute peak, seeing no real major crises until the later portion of Marcus Aurelius's reign. During that time, the same level of hubris was expressed through the increasing decadence occurring within Rome. Lavish, elaborate games were thrown in order to appease the increasingly complacent masses. This complacency seeped through the entire social order, even affecting those who would become emperor, as we saw with Marcus Aurelius' successor, Commodus. In both of these cases, there was a true sense of wealth and grandeur on display for all to see. Yet, at the same time, it generated a sense of hubris, which paved the way towards self-destruction. It is the recklessness of those in charge, challenging conventional wisdom on the false assumption of perpetual prosperity, that led to their doom. As G.K. Chesterton once said, "Every high society decays by forgetting obvious things." In Titanic, the obvious thing forgotten was the realization of the man-made nature of the ship and how man's creations are not invincible. They are, in fact, vulnerable and require proper stewardship to prevent catastrophe. In the case of these gilded eras in a civilization's history, it is the assumption of never-ending prosperity that lures them into a false sense of security. That false sense of security leads into complacency, which inevitably leads to collapse. As the final day of Titanic's life came to a close, so too did its Gilded Age, just as it did with every Gilded Age of every civilization that came before. Unbeknownst to all aboard, their downfall lay before them in the darkness of the frigid North Atlantic night. Part 2. The Downfall. It is in the darkness of the night that the fall comes to fruition. It's noted by all with experience that this moonless night, with the calmest seas no experienced crewman on board had ever witnessed before, is a true threat. And yet, in the film, no changes were made to the course, instead relying upon the skill of the crew to avert disaster. However, this is a gamble, as it forgets an important aspect. The crew are flawed. The two lookouts up in the crow's nest are momentarily distracted by Jack and Rose down below them, inadvertently sacrificing vital seconds that could have saved the ship. By the time they spot the iceberg in the cold, eerie darkness, they do whatever they can to avert the impending disaster lying before them. Every single member of the crew actively attempt to avert the iceberg, trying to turn the rudder hard to starboard to send the ship to port, and reverse the engines as to avoid the mountain of floating ice. And yet, it is all in vain. The Titanic violently scrapes up against the mountain-sized chunk of ice, buckling bulkheads which unleash a torrent of water into her cargo hold and into her watertight compartments. Those closest to the collision notice the disaster firsthand, especially those working in the boiler rooms. In the panic, they rush to save themselves, unable to fight against the relentless torrent of water flooding the forward boiler rooms. This mimics the initial confrontation with a crisis. The crew are akin to the military who, though diligent and well-trained, are still flawed. In the case of the lookouts in the crow's nest, they fell into a sense of complacency, worried more about how cold they were rather than what might be looming in the darkness. Even so, they reacted as quickly as they could and did their jobs to the best of their ability. In the end, the crew cannot be held at fault for the disaster, but those above them who overestimated their capabilities. It's a similar case for any army. An army, in any situation, is only as good as its leaders. If their leaders condemn them to damnation, then there isn't much the army can do. The late Roman Empire is the best example of this. The soldiers of the Roman legions were still diligent fighters, but it was often their leaders who squandered their abilities in fighting each other rather than securing and maintaining the empire's borders. Similarly, we see the same thing happening with the Wehrmacht during the Great War and the Second World War. It wasn't that they were bad at fighting, but that their leaders placed them in an unwinnable situation through poor decision after poor decision, which brought about their downfall. Once the crisis comes, those who are immediately impacted by it are those on the front lines. In the case of the Titanic, it was the crew in the boiler rooms. In the case of a civilization, it's often the frontline troops in the border regions. In the case of the Roman Empire, the iceberg striking the vessel would be akin to the incursion of Attila the Hun, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and all of the other major barbarian tribes to cross the border into the Roman Empire. Another example would be the start of a dry period in the Late Bronze Age, which helped precipitate the Late Bronze Age collapse in the 13th century BCE. The initial crisis is affected by those on the outlying periphery of the society first before it progresses further inward. In reaction to the collision, no one is quite sure what is going on in first class. Initially, they are awakened by the unfolding disaster and reluctantly begin to prepare. In this, the sudden startle leads to a small socialite event as the string band begins playing music to keep everyone calm. Meanwhile, down in the third-class steerage, the situation becomes quite apparent as water begins flooding into their rooms and down the hallway. The rats on board begin fleeing away from the encroaching water. In this, they immediately begin preparing for the worst and move away from the floodwaters to attempt to reach the upper decks. This is something we often see in societies in a crisis. The upper classes, initially, aren't affected as their money and affluence shields them from the impending disaster. However, the lower classes are impacted not long after those on the periphery. This is often what we see with an economic crisis, such as price inflation. A sudden spike in the price of food, for example, is far more likely to hurt the lower classes than it will the upper classes. This is what took place in the late Roman Republic, where the numbers of the lower class in Rome increased dramatically as they were crowded out of their small farms. This placed increased strain on the grain dole, which was meant to help supply the lower classes with grain as a foodstuff. The upper classes in Rome were not affected much at all by the policies they passed, but those in the lower classes were deeply impacted by these policies. We see a similar situation with the price inflation in the late Roman Empire. The emperors would often devalue their currency by reducing the silver content within their coinage, causing trust in the currency to fall. This would disproportionately affect the poor more as their meager earnings would only become less valuable, which could mean the difference between eating that night or not. As the film progresses and the ship sinks, it becomes more and more apparent to everyone on board of the true scale of the crisis. As the ship sinks lower into the cold, dark ocean, tensions only rise. There is a call to begin abandoning ship, which the crew attempt to keep under control. However, as the bridge begins sinking below the waves, the scene quickly turns into maddened chaos. People desperately run for the boats, trying to jump into their only form of salvation from the sinking vessel. Those who are on deck first, meaning the first class, are able to find their place on board their salvation and begin making their escape. As tensions rise, the crew become increasingly hostile and violent as those confined in the third class desperately try to make their way out by any means necessary. They push and shove at the frightened passengers. Some lock them down in the lower class sections to attempt to maintain order, and at one point, one crew member shoots several passengers who approach him in their desperation. While all of this is going on, the band's attempts to keep the peace have completely and utterly failed. Upon realizing this, the violinist and band leader, Wallace Hartley, portrayed by Jonathan Evan Jones, stops and decides to play one last tune, Nearer, My God, to Thee. The haunting, heartfelt tune is the final sign of the lightheartedness of the night previously, a final lament for the tragedy that has unfolded around him and his band. It is the final lament of what has fallen, the final inkling of artistic beauty and the outright chaos and horrors taking place around them. It is the final song of a eulogy, a final lament for the death throes of the Titanic and all the sad, forsaken souls still aboard the ensuing nightmare. In all of this, we can see the precipitous decline of civilization into chaos and anarchy. The crew, much like the military, attempt to maintain control in this crisis. However, as the population becomes increasingly desperate, the military becomes increasingly violent towards those they are meant to protect. This happened in Rome during the late Roman Republic. Legions had to be stationed just outside of the city in order to maintain order due to the frequency and viciousness of the riots that broke out, often leading to innumerable deaths in the process. When control is lost in a crisis situation, then all bets are off. All social conventions are thrown out the window. In the end, it becomes a question of kill or be killed. It becomes nothing more than a question of survival. In the film, we see three modes: those who have already found safety, those seeking to fight for their lives, and those who have accepted their fate. Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, Benjamin Guggenheim, portrayed by Michael Ensign, and others faced their demise. Some racked with the guilt of their actions, some faced it with as much honor as possible, and others faced it whether they had the option or not. With their deaths came the deaths of honest, noble men, men willing to admit the errors of their ways. Those who fought for survival, such as Jack and Rose, simply sought to survive in the hope of a better future, their ship of dreams now condemned to inevitable destruction. While those in safety, such as Bruce Ismay, had to grapple with their actions that night and, hopefully, may learn from their mistakes. In the end, this is what makes Titanic a tragedy, the sheer level of suffering and pain endured by all. When all was said and done, many survived, but countless more perished in the cold, unforgiving Atlantic. Just as with the demise of any civilization, some will survive, but many others won't make it through. The survivors of the horrors of war or the collapse of a way of life can count themselves as lucky. Some more than others. In the end, the survivors are the ones who are left to ask the question, what to do now? After witnessing such horrors take place, that question is difficult to answer, but in the end, it must be answered. Part 3. Posthoc Historical Interpretation. In the end, we come back to the beginning of the film, and its end. More specifically, we come back to the scenes taking place in the modern world, that being 1997's modernity. The beginning of the film shows off a Russian exploratory vessel being chartered by a man employed to look for the legended Heart of the Sea, a blue diamond that is allegedly as valuable as the Hope Diamond. It's this quest for the lost treasure that is believed lost on the Titanic that compels the elderly Rose to call this adventurer seeking the diamond and travel to the location. While on board of the exploratory vessel, the elderly Rose recounts the events of what happened, from her perspective, when inquired by those modern adventurers. In this, we can see a rather interesting allegory develop, the modern-day man attempting to understand the events of the past. These men looking for this diamond are, quite literally, treasure hunters, looking through the remains of the Titanic for a glimmer of the lost grandeur of the past. When diving the wreck, they are confronted with the vessel in its dilapidated, ruined form. This wouldn't be any different from an archaeologist or treasure hunter excavating the ruins of an ancient site, such as the ruins of Troy or the remains of Amarna. They would know of what this place is, but they wouldn't truly understand beyond a vague sense of knowing its importance. This is representative of the general veil of the past, how we, as modern men, are incapable of truly understanding what happened as we had never experienced such events ourselves. This is where the elderly Rose enters the picture. In this, she represents something more profound than simply an old woman who had a romantic fancy aboard this vessel. She is, for those in the film, and for the audience, a window into the past, a glimpse into the events of what happened. In this way, she's akin to the historical sources we have on events such as the fall of Rome. She offers us a glimpse into the past, to come to understand the splendor of the Gilded Age and how it all came tumbling down. And yet, the film also makes note that she's not infallible herself. More specifically, midway through the film, she asserts that she did not sleep with Jack, though, in reality, the film makes it self-evident that she lied about this point. This offers a clear example of how Rose is not a perfect account of historical events that took place. She is, as all people are, flawed. As a result, you still would have to take what she says with a grain of salt, just as we have to be wary of believing everything that is said by a historical commentary. However, just because she is flawed does not mean what she said isn't true, nor does it mean that events that took place didn't happen. To that, we know for certain that she is still correct in those details, and thus she provides a window into the past just as the historical accounts of Cassius Dio, Livy, or Tacitus provide us a window into the events of the past. In the end, it is because of Rose's testimony that the men looking for the heart of the sea eventually come to realize the folly of their actions. Their epiphany is the tragedy of the event, to understand what pain and suffering those aboard went through. This attitude carries over to any and all corners of studying the events of the past. When learning about these things, about those civilizations of the past, and how they saw their demise, we can empathize with them. We can come to appreciate them, their people, and the core nature of their humanity that we still share today. Lessons can be learned from their follies, so that we may, hopefully, come to avoid them. The film ends with the elderly Rose sleeping, dreaming of the glory of the Titanic, and finally rejoining Jack aboard that ship of dreams. It is the purest expression of the fantasy we all often share, the longing to return back to our past, to return to those better gilded days that have come to pass. The inevitable human desire to return to the traditions of the past and to remember the good times rather than be caught up in their flaws is something we all share. Those past civilizations may have been flawed, but that does not diminish from their glory. They may have come to pass, but it does not mean we cannot appreciate them still, to long to bring back those aspects we loved without the flaws and errors made by those of that time. In the end, what Titanic has done is encapsulate the human nature of human society in a singular film. from its grandeur and glory to its flawed nature to its inevitable decline and death, and encapsulates it all, making us all lament for the loss of the fine vessel and the souls that went down with her. Truly, it is an emotionally moving masterpiece.